when this war started back in February 3 years ago, most analysts believe this was to take the whole of Ukraine, and that Russia thought it would be able to move in really quickly and just seize it. Clearly, that's not going to be possible and anytime soon. And Russia certainly doesn't have the military might now to take the whole of Ukraine. So if you were to look at it from a grand strategic perspective, Putin has failed. Now, if you then sort of go, okay, he then had to step back and work out, okay, what am I going to achieve?
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. Today we're joined by retired Air Vice Marshal Sean Bell, a former fighter pilot and host of the Red Matrix podcast. We're going to be talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine. Sean, welcome.
Hey, good morning to you.
89,000 Russian soldiers killed in the war in Ukraine have been identified so far as part of an ongoing joint media zona BBC Russia investigation. That's obviously only a fraction of Russian casualties, but can you put into context for us the scale of the conflict in Ukraine?
Well, you just said the numbers. How large is the British Army today? It's a smaller number than that. And therefore, that's how many Russia has lost. Now, I would caveat, anytime we talk about numbers, it's enormously emotive because Ukraine doesn't talk about numbers. Russia doesn't talk about numbers. There's various organizations that try and make an assessment. So I wouldn't get stuck on a particular number. What I would say is Russia's tactics are a grinding war of attrition. They clearly don't care about the casualties. They just throw large numbers at the fight. And talking to some Ukrainians when I was out there just a few weeks ago, they were heartbroken because they said it's just they're easy pickings. And it felt almost like a computer game, but you are with people's lives. And that's the tragedy. And I think it's for every one death you have, it's normally 3 or 4 that are seriously wounded because obviously the minority actually die. And that just gives an idea of the dreadful toll, not only for the Russians, but also for the Ukrainians in this war. I think the tragedy, it's fallen a little bit off the radar for obvious reasons over the last few weeks, what with political and conflict in other parts of the world. But the war is ground on. And one of the tricky issues here, big picture, is that we in the West provided technology, weapons to Ukraine to avoid them having to do this war of attrition. As those weapons have run out, we've still managed to give the Ukrainians artillery, shells and bullets. But all of that plays back into this dreadful war of attrition, which just piles the bodies up on both sides. And bluntly, however nasty and horrible it sounds, the bigger side generally wins an attritional battle. And that's something that Ukraine has been seeking to avoid. So going back to your question about numbers, it's horrendous. There is a horrendous price to pay. But Russia tactically has managed to steer Ukraine into the sort of fight it wants to have because it knows that it will eventually prevail if this remains a war of attrition. And that's something that Russia can live with. Ukraine probably can't.
There are still, however, as you say, both sides have got problems with manpower. Russian casualty rates are largely regarded now as being unsustainable. Do you see them coming down in 2025, if for no other reason than they will simply run out of that number of troops?
Well, it's a really interesting question because, first of all, don't forget, it's not just Russian troops. We've got North Korean troops. We can discuss the numbers, but around 12 or 13,000 are believed to have joined the fight. And although we understand that North Korea was told they were simply taking over domestic security duties to free up Russian soldiers to go to the front line, there's growing evidence that that's clearly not the case, that Russia is literally just throwing them at the fight. And there's lots of reports now that, a significant proportion of those soldiers have now been killed or injured. And it's very interesting to see how that will play back to North Korea. Again, because you've got in North Korea's dictator, you have somebody who probably doesn't care about the bodies. What he cares about is what Russia gives him in return. And that is something that I suspect at a grand strategic level is heartbreaking for the families concerned. But going back to your point about sustainability, though, I do think the prevailing view among military experts, and I'm sort of networked with quite a lot of this, comes up with exactly that phrase. So the question really is, why is Russia pushing so hard? This is the winter months. Generally speaking, the weather in Ukraine is pretty awful. It gets sub-zero, the ground hardens, you can't dig trenches. It becomes a lot more difficult. You don't have the foliage to hide behind. So it's a lot more dangerous to fight and a lot more difficult. Just staying alive is difficult enough. So you have to ask why Russia's doing this. And almost certainly that is they can see a finishing line approaching, and therefore they're pushing everything at it to try to get to that finishing line. And let's just try and work out what we think that is. And almost certainly that is Donald Trump's arrival in the White House on the 20th of January. He has said publicly that he would solve the conflict in Ukraine in 24 hours, although interestingly over the last couple of days, some of his people have now said, oh, it's going to be 100 days. In other words, it is going to take time. But I think that Putin sees an opportunity for consolidating because, bluntly, he might have achieved one of his objectives, which is the land bridge down to Crimea and Crimea. And therefore, how does he lift sanctions? How does he get his place back in the world order? And part of that may be the big negotiating tool he has is, I can stop the war. You can't, I can. And I suspect what he wants to try and do and achieve all his initial objectives now, push as hard as possible, and then potentially use the next few years to regenerate, rebuild his stocks of weapons, people and the like, and then work out what he does next.
Britain's Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, is on his way back across Europe now after meeting President Zelensky. He's made what's been termed a sort of 100-year pledge of support for Kyiv. What do we know about the specifics of this deal?
It's fascinating, isn't it? I think part of what we're seeing politically, I don't want to underplay the importance of a British Prime Minister going out, but bluntly, when you try and find the detail, it's quite difficult to see anything that's game-changing. What the British Prime Minister is trying to do is add a bit of substance to the rhetoric that we're with you to the end. And by doing a 100-year deal, quite frankly, I'd be very surprised if any terms of a 100-year deal will prevail. But it's a sense of political commitment, and that is exactly what President Zelensky is looking for some of Europe. But what it actually talks to, I was in the European Parliament earlier on in the week, helping chair a panel on Ukraine. And what was fascinating is that the Ukraine conflict is starting to divide some of Europe's leaders. Why is that? A whole bundle of reasons. One of them is that inevitably different countries feel the heat from Russia in different ways. And there is this sense that if there is a move toward an endgame, if it is true that President Trump is seeking to bring the war to an end, then the danger is that emboldens Putin, that he gets himself ready for another bite of the cherry. And there are some of the countries like Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, the sort of Baltic states, that know that they might be next to be swallowed up by Russia. Likewise, Poland. And I think what you're seeing in Europe is a stark fracturing of some of the countries that feel far enough away and just go, do you know, Russia's broken itself on the back of this invasion of Ukraine. You know, we don't have to do very much more. We're going to have to talk to Putin. We want to do deals with him. Let's get at the front of the queue for that. And there are some states in Europe going, hang on a minute. The worst thing that can happen is that actually we do a deal, because that will simply embolden Putin and create a problem for our successors.
And there are reports now that the UK and France are in some forms of talks over sending possible peacekeepers to Ukraine. Even if these boots on the ground, as it were, weren't patrolling the front lines, how could that change the dynamic of the war? And is it even realistic?
Well, I think we've got to put this into context, because it's a really interesting headline. And I think inevitably the big question is the West or any members of the West prepared to actually step in to stop Russia? Because let's be quite clear that, if NATO or even the US, potentially some European countries, were to actually get involved, Russia would be stopped in a heartbeat. It has struggled to process this war against Ukraine, which was not well equipped, former Soviet Union equipment. Most of it doesn't work that well. And yet, because of their bravery, tenacity, they've held out Russia. And Russia has suffered massive casualties. If you were to bring the might of NATO, whose military power is orders of magnitude more than Russia has, this will be stopped in a heartbeat. So part of it, and I don't sense any appetite for the West to do that at the moment, despite the fact that morally, the West said in the Budapest Memo of 1994, Ukraine, you give up your nuclear weapons and we will guarantee the security and sovereignty of your territory. That was America, Russia, and the UK. And what do we do when Russia ripped that up? We just stood by. So morally, there's a question there. But going back to your question about sort of peacekeepers, so I don't think the West is ready to step in and actually get involved directly. So what we're talking about here is when the war is over, in whatever form, whether it's a ceasefire or actually a war, what Zelensky will need is some form of cast iron guarantees that Russia isn't just taking a pause to rearm, re-equip, and then come again. And he won't take a signature on a bit of paper. 1994, the Budapest Memo was a proof of that. So all of a sudden it becomes, okay, NATO is top of the list. I think it's very unlikely that NATO will offer membership to Ukraine anytime soon. We could get into that, but there's a whole bundle of reasons why Ukraine actually doesn't qualify for membership of NATO at the moment. But there are other ways that could be more robust than simply a signature on a bit of paper. One of them is UN peacekeeping forces. I have to say, in my military career, 35 years, I bumped into the United Nations forces around the world. And whilst they are a very good political gesture, they generally aren't that robust when it comes to military capability. And I think anything in this context, Putin has made clear that he's a bully and actually he will not respect anything other than strength. So I'd be very surprised if any form of EU force had the credibility to do that. So the alternative then becomes bilateral or trilateral arrangements with other countries. For example, if the US was to put a military base into eastern Ukraine, if the UK, France, or other European countries were to do something similar, then any attack on Ukraine would be an attack on those nations, and suddenly you'd have a much more robust situation on your hands, not only for air power. And I think we should return. I know I'm a former airman, but the reality is I've spent more time at sea than my naval contemporaries and more time on the land. But without air power, it's very difficult to see in history how any country has prevailed in a war like this. Ukraine doesn't have any credible air power, and it has suffered. If you were to get some sort of bilateral or trilateral arrangement where you had NATO or Western air power patrolling the skies, Russia would have a much more difficult time on its hands to actually present a threat to Ukraine. I know it's a long answer, but I think the issue of actually just having peacekeeping forces probably isn't robust enough, but there are other answers out there. And I think that's what the EU and Zelensky are looking to explore.
Of course, all of this is being spurred on by the imminent inauguration of Donald Trump as US president. Trump's pick for Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has recently said he would support further sanctions on Russia, but Trump himself and his team around him say no to things like Ukraine in NATO and generally seem to want to keep America out of this element of European security. Where does that leave Kiev and Zelensky and the conflict as a whole?
Yeah, there's a lot of lenses you can look through this issue. I know, the Trump arrival, he's a disruptor, isn't he? Everybody's sort of wondering what on earth he's going to do, and the one-liners are scaring people. Let's try and pick apart that question, though, into its elements. So one of which is sanctions. I am a sort of veteran of 35 years of military experience, and I have to say I'm a bit cynical about the impact of sanctions. Of course, they have a part to play, but you're not going to stop Russia with sanctions. That in big handfuls, a country like UK would suffer with sanctions because we don't have any natural resources that we rely on trade and goods to actually generate wealth. A country like Russia has huge oil and gas resources, and the world needs oil and gas. So we can tinker at the edges of all this. And yes, we've stopped buying oil and gas from Russia in various forms. But in simple terms, the world consumes 100 barrels of oil a year. We may not be buying it from Russia now. We may be buying it from India or somewhere else. But all that's happened is that same 100 barrels of oil are being generated. They're just flowing in a different direction around the world. And, Russia may be suffering a little bit of a lower revenue as a result of having to deal with other countries. But let's not kid ourselves. Oil and gas are incredibly profitable businesses, and Russia is still making a hell of a lot of money. So my point being is that I think we've got to be very careful about sanctions, and I suspect Donald Trump knows that. They're more of a political gesture. What the only robust way of dealing with a bully like Putin is to stand up to him. It's a bit like the bully at school. You can try and placate them all you like, but somebody eventually has to stand up and be counted. And that's what the West has yet to do. Putin will feel emboldened. And whilst he may be struggling on the battlefield, he's also doing lots of grey zone activity. And I think the challenge Trump has got is he knows all of this. And what he wants to do is get the EU to step up to the plate. And one of the things that's close to my heart is NATO. That Trump has never appeared to be much of a fan of NATO. And of course, that's bred speculation that America will walk away. Let me turn that on its head, though. We live in a country where we're short of money. There is a requirement. If you want to be part of the biggest security membership organization in the world, NATO, you can't expect to be in it for free. You have to pay your way. At the moment, that's at 2% of GDP to make it fair. Every country in NATO committed to do that. Still, a third of the countries in NATO do not pay their way. Countries like Canada and Italy still pay less than 1.5%. Now, is it reasonable for countries to hide under the NATO umbrella but expect America to pay for their security? I don't think that's remotely credible. And therefore, I think it's entirely appropriate that a deal maker like Trump shakes that tree and also makes clear to Europe, if you don't want to pay your dues, then you're not going to expect America to provide that umbrella. And besides, an incentive for you is that America sees China as the big emerging threat. China is a huge economic powerhouse, so is America. And Trump is trying to position itself as that counterweight to China. And it's looking at things like Russia and going, okay, Europe, stop freeloading. It's on your doorstep. Deal with it. And in a way, I admire that sort of focused rhetoric, because I think all countries in NATO should be paying their way. It's difficult enough for us to do it. And actually, one of the ways Trump has suggested is that we all should be paying 5%. Now, in this country, we're struggling to get to 2.5%. A story for another day. But as a seasoned veteran of the military, we used to spend well over 4% in the Cold War. This feels more dangerous to me than it was when I served in the Cold War. And yet, therefore, we're only proposing to try and struggle to get up to 2.5%. The real answer is that we should be spending significantly more on defence if we're going to have a credible way of defending our populations of the future. And I think that's what Trump stands for. He's a disruptor. He's saying, I'm not prepared to keep subsidizing NATO to help European countries battle their overdrafts. And in a way, I think that's to be admired. How he does it, yep, there's going to be a few newspaper headlines along the way. But as a principle, I think there's a lot of people welcoming that approach.
You mentioned oil revenues there. Over recent days, Ukraine has been striking oil depots south of Moscow. It's part of their ongoing campaign against Russian energy infrastructure. Reuters is now reporting that Russian oil exports have fallen by 10% in 2024, in part due to that strike campaign. How crucial are those energy revenues for Putin's war chest?
They are quite that significant, but I mean, there's a couple of things here. One of which is Putin has managed to convert his economy to a wartime economy. When we are talking about spending 2 or 3% of GDP on defence, I think the Russian figures are now orbiting towards 30% of their GDP. I mean, it's huge. That will have long-term, profound implications, and most of that wealth is generated through oil revenues, and there's much publicized that Ukraine has been very successfully targeting some of that. The trouble for me with all of this is that the time it takes for those sorts of impacts to work their way through to stopping Russia fight the war are measured in years. They're not measured in days. And at the moment, the currency that counts in this war is territory. And unfortunately, what's happening there is Russia this year, and for most of last year, has been grinding forward. It has been making territorial gains. Ukraine is on the back foot, and that is incredibly difficult for Ukraine. And the worry was that actually it's a bit like a dam cracking, that maybe one of those cracks would suddenly open and suddenly Russia would pour in. Now, most military assessments say that Russia doesn't have the strength to exploit any breakthrough of the lines. It's very unlikely they could make a strategic gain. But all of these other activities that Ukraine are doing into Russian territory are largely designed to take the war to Russia, to make Russian feel that they're in a war. That's what the Kursk invasion was for. That's what these attacks on oil infrastructure. I wouldn't want to belittle it, but it's not going to change the course of the war in the near term. What is fighting on the front line. Ukraine has a major problem with recruiting and weapons, and Russia is capitalizing on that. It's been doing it through the winter. If it continues into the spring and summer, this could be a very difficult year for Ukraine.
We have seen, of course, you mentioned Kursk there, more offensive maneuvers by Ukraine into Kursk. Is that likely to shift the dial at all?
I think what you're seeing there is a preparation for the potential negotiation with Putin. Just imagine, I don't want to oversimplify this, but Russia, when Ukraine burst into Kursk, it was the first time that Russia has been invaded since the Second World War. And hundreds of thousands of people being relocated will have spread a message of fear within Russia. That would have been deeply embarrassing for Putin, and therefore was expected that he would throw all his resources at pushing Ukraine out. In many ways, that was probably Ukraine's strategy, to ease the pressure on their front line in the Donbass, because Russia would move forces round to push them out of Kursk. Now, as it's turned out, Russia hasn't really done that. What it's done is it's kept up the momentum in the south, brought North Korean soldiers in to try and deal with the Kursk offensive. And most military analysts, including myself, thought it would be very difficult for Ukraine to hold out in Russian territory for any length of time. And therefore, they would probably do a managed withdrawal rather than die in a sort of Custer's last stand in the Kursk. In fact, they've been very effective at holding the line, although Russia has gradually squeezed that enclave. It's significantly smaller today than it was when the Ukrainians first moved in. But the North Koreans have clearly been involved in the fight, and they're clearly paying a very high price for it. So Russia almost certainly thought that put a 10,000 North Koreans, they can clear the Ukrainians out of Kursk. They weren't able to do that. And I think what we're seeing now is that President Zelensky, if he knows that he might be coming up to some form of negotiated settlement, if he holds any land in Russia, that would be immensely powerful for him in a negotiation. Putin knows that. He almost certainly will not enter a negotiation until he's pushed Ukrainian forces out. How that will play out, it's anybody's guess at the moment. But I think we're seeing that Ukraine is not going to give up without a fight.
And you mentioned there, of course, Russia continues to push forward in the Donbass in eastern Ukraine. Is Putin going to be happy if he has to go to the table in the next few months with what he has managed to get in the Donbass? Because obviously he still hasn't seized the whole of Luhansk and Donetsk.
No, there's a couple of questions in there. One of which is that when this war started back in February 3 years ago, most analysts believe this was to take the whole of Ukraine, and that Russia thought it would be able to move in really quickly and just seize it. Clearly, that's not going to be possible and anytime soon. And Russia certainly doesn't have the military might now to take the whole of Ukraine. So if you were to look at it from a grand strategic perspective, Putin has failed. Now, if you then sort of go, okay, he then had to step back and work out, okay, what am I going to achieve? One of the without going through a history lesson, the Crimean Peninsula, and particularly the port of Sevastopol, was incredibly important historically for Putin. And although it was owned, inverted commas, by Ukraine, it was only because it was given by Khrushchev back in the 50s to Ukraine, because it was administratively easier for that region of the former Soviet Union to run it. And one of the reasons, therefore, Putin was never going to give up Sevastopol and Crimea. When Ukraine talked about joining the EU, talked about joining NATO, Russia had to create a land bridge to Crimea to stop it getting isolated. So by creating the sort of Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia land bridge, he now has guaranteed access to Crimea, both by land and by sea. So I'm not saying it's a success, but as a modified objective for what he now has always said, a special military operation, I think he'll be relatively happy with that. Of course, subject to negotiations, he will be able to sell that as a major victory to the Russian people, that he's secured the land, and whatever the price, he's returned some of the Russian territory to Russia. And of course, the Russian people will not be told, they're not being told now, of the huge numbers of casualties, the price that's being paid for all this. And history generally is written by the by the winners, and therefore he will write a version of history which will demonstrate this was part of Russia becoming great again. So I think there's some interesting, I think purely parochially, if Russia walks away from any form of deal with its territory and some of the sanctions lifted and a seat back at the table with the world, I can see that in the short term that will appease a lot of politicians because they want the war to be over. As a strategist, I look at that and go, that could be an absolute nightmare for us and global security, because what will North Korea take of that? What will Iran take from that? What will China take from that? There are lots of profound lessons to be learned from this. And I think we've got to be really careful that institutional short-termism, which is what our political masters tend to be very good at, might come at a huge cost.
And Sean, just finally, we were talking earlier a little bit about these grey zone attacks that Russia has been using to put pressure on Ukraine's European allies. Just in the last few days, a French maritime patrol jet has been locked onto by a Russian S-400 missile system over the Baltic Sea, France's defense minister has said. You were a former fighter pilot, of course. In the first instance, how dangerous is that? And more widely, what does it tell us about these grey zone attacks in Europe?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things here. One of which is when you're some of the Russian air defense systems, S-300, S-400, they're a multi-layered system. So the one radar looks long range, so it can look hundreds of miles, and it can detect where there are potential targets. Generally speaking, when it locks on, it uses a different radar system, which is a much more focused, closer range to actually launch a missile. And you in the cockpit have a set of equipment that give an indication of what's looking at you and how far it is away. And there are a whole load of techniques that you can use to combat that. From basic World War II things like using chaff, which is little bits of foil that deceive the radar, to all sorts of very clever electronic means, and of course flares, multispectral flares as well. By being locked up, what Russia is doing is it's just provoking. We're not sure whether it's a long-range radar that's locked up and the aircraft suddenly got an indication. But this is Russia flexing its muscles. It's saying that, we're not dead and gone. And I think part of your question around these grey zone attacks is that Russia knows that it's bullied the West into not getting involved. It's scared the Western politicians with its nuclear saber rattling. It knows that it's challenging the world order. Russia's very clearly said it doesn't want to see an American-led world. It thinks there's alternatives out there. And the longer it goes on without the West standing toe-to-toe with Russia, the more Russia will feel emboldened to do all of these sort of cyber attacks, grey zone attacks, will feel emboldened. If a missile system locks you up, that is an offensive act. In my book and in the Cold War, you'd have immediately returned a missile at that site and blown it up. No question. Somebody pulls a gun on you, you are entitled to do something in retaliation. And we don't do that. Russia fires missiles that go into other people's airspace. The reaction to that should be a straight missile back to the launch point of that missile. They conducted an offensive act. This is an act of self-defense. But for some reason, we've allowed ourselves to get soft over the years, and Putin knows he can get away with this sort of thing. We have the technology to give Putin a bloody nose every time he does these sorts of attacks. We choose not to do it. That, I think, has become a fatal mistake for the West.
And the Russians, having seen that, even if there is an opportunity to bring Putin to the table for ceasefire negotiations, do you think these kind of hybrid threats are going to go away?
I think if you were Putin at the moment, you'd feel, I'm achieving my objectives on the battlefields of Ukraine. The war has to end. I'm throwing a lot of people at it. It's not sustainable from a soldier perspective, and it's hurting financially. And the oligarchs that probably hold the real power are probably closing the door and having meetings with Putin saying, look, we can't go to Paris for our holidays. We can't send our kids to private school. We can't enjoy our wealth because we can't go anywhere at the moment. And Putin's probably saying, yeah, I know, we're close to the end game. But he knows that will come with some form of negotiation. And what he's trying to do is strengthen his hand before that. And therefore, by showing that it's not just about a remote war in Ukraine, he's actually able to do attacks all over the place. And therefore, he's forcing the West's hand to want to negotiate. And of course, the problem there is it relates back to appeasement at the start before the Second World War, that it's much easier to appease and sign a bit of paper than stand toe to toe and say, no, you can't keep doing this, and actually meet force with force. One of the great examples of this is, Putin with his nuclear saber rattling forward deployed nuclear weapons into Belarus. And there's no reason militarily for doing that. It's purely political gesturing. If the West had literally matched that, said, okay, we're going to forward deploy nuclear weapons to Ukraine, as soon as there was even talk of that, Putin went mad. And you went, no, this is simply matching what you have done. And for some reason, we're not doing that. And I do appreciate there's a risk to escalation. There's a risk to standing toe to toe. But frankly, unless you stand toe to toe with bullies, history demonstrates you'll be significantly worse off and you'll pay a high price.
Sean Bell, thank you very much for joining us today on Frontline.
My pleasure.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news and analysis, or read it on thetimes.com. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.